Hello. A number of my previous M150 students that have just started studying MT264 have asked me to go through the main differences and similarities between JavaScript as studied in M150 and the Visual Basic as studied in MT264. Generally, I think you'll find them fairly similar. With any sort of programming, it's all to do with the change in syntax aren't the main thing. It's understanding the underlying theory behind it. So as long as you've grasped all the concepts that have been covered in M150, then you should find they're just applicable to MT264. So as you can see on the screen, I've created two versions of a very simple little application. All it does is it prompts the user to enter 4 different TMA scores, calculates the average, and it outputs it. So very straightforward little application. If you compare the two screens, you'll see that the declaration, the top version is VB and the bottom is JavaScript, which I hope you worked out. The declaration lines are slightly different. In JavaScript we just use the var keyword to declare that we have a variable. We don't worry about its type in M150. In MT264 and in VB generally you do need to worry about the type of each of your variables. Why this might seem slightly restrictive if you're coming at it from the JavaScript side of things, having just done M150 where you don't really need to care about it. But if you've ever tried in your M150 coursework to start putting strings into integer, what you intended to be an integer, or you start adding things up which you're not quite sure what types they are, then you'll appreciate why possibly that VB is a little bit more stern than JavaScript in insisting it. It does mean that you have to think harder about types of things, but hopefully you shouldn't be declaring variables that you use for multiple different types of thing anyway. So it should help you in that if in Visual Basic you define something as an integer variable, then you're unable to put something that is a string into it, and it won't actually let the line of code compile, so it prevents you from making mistakes, which is quite handy. The other thing that you'll notice between the two pieces of code is in my initialize variables section. I've got number of TMAs is declared in both, that is initialized in both. Total score is only set to 0 in the JavaScript. If you declare something as an integer in Visual Basic, it will automatically assign it the value of 0. Similarly, if you have a string, it will automatically assign it a null string value. It's normally, I think, good practice to initialize your variables. Just so you know what they are. I've deliberately left it out here just to make a point, but I would normally I'd normally set the total score to 0 just so you know you've got a good starting point. And the other thing to look at within this small little snippet of code is the for loop. So syntax is completely different between the two languages. I've declared a new variable in each case called count, which is an integer variable. So you can see that's done in a slightly different way in each language. In the JavaScript I have to specify the increment of the for loop, so it's count equals count plus 1. Within Visual Basic it assumes you always want to go up in ones. There are ways of specifying to go up in different increments of step, but you don't need to worry about that yet at this stage. Within my for loop, within the JavaScript I've got curly brackets that open and close the for loop. That's the main body of it. Within Visual Basic I don't have that. I've got a for statement, I've got a next, which delimits the top and the bottom of the for statement. Anything that's included within those two is counted as a compound statement within the for loop. So in this case I'm using a get score function, which I'll come on to later, and then just totaling up the score. So again in Visual Basic this is much better in that we know that total score is an integer because we've defined it as such, and a bit later you'll see get score returns an integer. Within the JavaScript we could be adding strings onto integers, could be doing all sorts of things there. Purely because we don't have a type that we know of. If you've made the mistake in JavaScript of not initializing your total score to 0, you end up with something that returns not a number at the end. So again, that's quite a handy thing to stop you making those errors. In the JavaScript code, I've got a document.write to output it to the screen. I've got an equivalent, a sort of broadly equivalent thing as a console write line in Visual Basic. Again, I'll come on to output shortly so you can see other ways of doing that. Okay, so now we'll just have a quick look at the function. So in both cases it does exactly the same thing. It takes something I've called TMA number, which is an integer, and it should return an integer, so it will prompt the users to say, you know, what's the score for TMA1, and then return the value. It's in a function because if the TMA score that's entered is less than 0, then I automatically set it to 0. You'll notice the first thing probably you'll notice about this is the type conversion that's taking place. So whereas in JavaScript you're encouraged to use parseInt and parseFloat, although actually normally it didn't make a lot of difference if you didn't, within Visual Basic you'll need to think about your type conversions. So if you are using a function that returns a string, I've got input box here which returns a string value, you're going to need to convert that to the appropriate type before you store it in your variable. Hopefully you're already doing this in JavaScript, so it should be a relatively straightforward process just to start thinking about how you do this in Visual Basic. If you look at the if statement here, it's a similar difference between the two as the for statement that we just talked about. So the if statement in Visual Basic will start, it's delimited with an if something then, and it ends with an end if, so it doesn't need the curly brackets. Same principle otherwise. It should always return, have a Boolean statement, so it will return always true or false. In the Visual Basic example I could have bracketed the ATMA score less than 0 just to make it clear, so you don't need to worry too much about that. The only other main difference here I think is the use of semicolons, which obviously in Visual Basic you don't need to use them, which is a good thing because most people forget or put them in the wrong place, so you no longer need to worry about it. So functions work in broadly the same way as they do between JavaScript and Visual Basic. Don't worry for now about that nasty by val keyword in the function. That will come up later on in the course. Similarly, things like private and public functions come up a bit later, so at the moment I'm glossing over it. So the main syntactical differences between VB and JavaScript aren't all that much. As long as you have a really good grasp of the underlying concepts of the procedural code in JavaScript, you should be able to write code in Visual Basic. Things like if statements, for loops, while loops, variable declaration, you should already be really familiar with that. The main difference when you start looking at MT264 is that it uses the object-oriented sort of approach, whereas JavaScript is writing procedural code. So that's the main thing for you to be concentrating on, is that you understand the difference between the two. The other thing is, if you look at my Visual Basic application here, I've tried as hard as I can to replicate the JavaScript just so you've got something to compare and contrast between the two. However, as I'm sure you've hopefully worked out, it's not the best way to do it. Visual Basic is helpful in that it provides a user interface. So for example, a arguably better solution would be to create a series of text boxes to enter your values in, or any other similar version than that, rather than constantly prompting the user. So do have a think about what's appropriate and what's possible in Visual Basic. It's a very powerful development environment that will let you interact with your user in completely different ways. So don't worry about syntax between the two languages. Do worry about what Visual Basic offers you and what it allows you to do within the object-oriented framework. So hopefully that's been useful, and you have a bit more of an understanding of how the two languages differ and indeed how they're similar. And I hope you can use that soon. Thank you very much for watching.